The gentleman from Charlottesville, Mr. Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen in the House, in the aftermath of the several dust-ups on the House floor yesterday, I went back to my my office and curled up with my book, my edition of the Federalist Papers, and I even got out to Tocqueville. And I hope, I tried to think a little bit about what happened yesterday, and I hope that you'll indulge me a few minutes to share my thoughts. You know, this is a difficult time of year anyway. Tempers are short, and misunderstandings are rampant and are magnified by the pressures of being away from home for so long, and the partisan conflict that exists anyway over a wide variety of issues. Nonetheless, events like yesterday should prompt us all to reflect a little bit more about what we learn every day down here and about our roles in representing our constituents in the legislative process. You know, in hindsight, the dispute yesterday about the bills vetoed by the governor might have been avoided with a simple face-to-face discussion before the bills arrived for consideration, or at the very least by taking the bills by temporarily. But I get it. Everything goes fast around here, and we've got to cut each other a little bit of slack every once in a while. If that had happened, we wouldn't have had that public display, and perhaps could have just moved forward, heeding the words of the gentleman from Caroline, who at the end of the debate uttered something I thought made a lot of sense, and backed up by the delegate from Loudoun, that, you know, maybe we should extend a courtesy to a member to handle his or her own bill in his or her own way. In the past, we have heard that when bills hit the floor, they are the province of the body. I've never really believed that. But when something as important as governor's vetoes hit the floor, the minority has a right, I think we have a duty, to ask why they're being treated in a certain way, especially when the request is made outside of what we're trying to do here to streamline the process and make it a little easier for people to understand. You know, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, we extend courtesies all the time to each other. For example, the gentlewoman from Campbell on her cable bill, which she even admitted was not exactly ready for prime time when it hit the floor. We gave her the courtesy of passing the bill that needed some work because we trusted her that she would do it as it continued through the process. Similarly, when the gentleman from Fairfax, who now looks like he's gone out to have a bite to eat, came to us with a request for additional time so we could consider judges because the Senate was attempting to foul up a very good process they have for choosing judges in Northern Virginia. We extended the courtesy. It made sense. Now, this courtesy, of course, required a supermajority vote, but we gave it to him. And, of course, just yesterday, we extended the courtesy to the gentleman from Loudoun, Delegate LaRock, so he could submit his resolution to celebrate winery in his region. Of course, it was subject to the promise that he provide us each with a bottle, but the courtesy was extended nonetheless. Heck, I even remember granting unanimous consent, not objecting to a request for unanimous consent by the former gentleman from Bedford when he tried to introduce, after the deadline, an entirely new budget. That was amazing. You should have heard what kind of flack I caught down the hall for extending that courtesy. But nonetheless, we do it. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen in the House, when you are in the minority, you only have a limited number of tools at your disposal. First, you have the force of public opinion. And in some cases, it can be very powerful in mobilizing events against bills that you consider to be offensive. Secondly, you have always the power of rational argument. The idea that if people listen, they might actually change their minds. Now, maybe not on a single vote, but over time, they may change their views about things. And finally, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, the minority always has the Constitution, House procedures, and rules. Now, to suggest that the minority not use all of those things at its disposal, including procedures and rules that some people might find occasionally outrageous, maybe even silly, is to misunderstand the very nature of the democratic process. Ladies and gentlemen, if you think I get my jollies about raising procedural issues, you are sadly mistaken. And if you notice, the procedural issues are usually involve bills that we find offensive over here. There are plenty of others you could attack, but we don't because we grant each other a level of courtesy. Our role as a minority is to prod, to probe, to challenge, to object, to attempt to defeat any legislation we think is bad, and to work to improve legislation that is not as good as it needs to be. That's why we show up at Delegate Jones's conferences on the budget, to make it better. The majority is not the repository of all virtue, truth, or good ideas. Occasionally, the minority has something to say about that. We're ready to consider the budget today. Do you know several years ago, we could vote on a budget in 2 minutes? But the minority suggested we ought to have it on our desk for a couple days so we could look at it, and so could the public. Now it became part of what we do. The minority also suggested that perhaps we should know whether there are things in the budget that weren't in either budget. And so now there's a rule that says you have to publish with the conference report anything that was not in either budget or any legislation that shows up there. In conclusion, admittedly, strong minorities always irritate the majority. But that is essential for our system to work. As a majority, you have a lot of power. But without us, the system of countervailing power and checks and balances that our founders relished and we continue to celebrate cannot work. You would create a tyranny of the majority, as Tocqueville decried, and you will leave the legislative process in disarray and further damage our already fragile democracy. So let us remember, we all play roles in this body, and playing them properly makes the system work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well said. I was a little concerned when you got up you were going to take back all the nice things you said about me on Monday.